I talk to a lot of MSPs out there who are looking to level up their security across their customers and provide a better offering, but aren't sure either where to start or what roadmap to follow to get them into that compliant state. So in this video, I'm going to share with you a framework that I built that you can leverage to help scale out your operations and uplift the cybersecurity of your downstream customers in 4 repeatable steps. I'm going to be showing you how to do this with a tool that I built called Cloud Capsule that actually automates your security assessments of Microsoft 365 across the CIS controls. Some of the byproducts that you'll experience by adopting this framework is that number 1, you're going to organize your MSP to a standard that you're delivering across all of your customers. Number 2, you're going to increase your client profitability. Number 3, you're going to decrease the reactive hours that you spend with each client. And number 4, you're going to go ahead and operationalize in a way that allows you to monitor and continuously improve the security across all of your downstream customers. So a lot to unpack today. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Nick. I'm a Microsoft MVP and I've been working here on the channel for the better half of a decade. If you haven't already, definitely like and subscribe to the channel to see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space. Let's go ahead and dive in. So before we get into the 4 steps here, I first wanted to quickly talk about standardization and how important that is to your MSP. When you think about standardization, or I think about the common MSP out there, we have a tendency to be very reactive. And a lot of that I think has to come from the previous break-fix rules that many of us were before. When we talk about standardization, we're really talking about getting organized, which inadvertently makes us become less reactive. And that is incredibly important, not only for customer profitability, but for kind of the concepts that we're going to be getting into today as far as how you can scale out this practice across all of your customers. So on the security front, what I see a lot of MSPs doing today is trying to gap fill and kind of plug a bunch of holes in security with various vendors. And so effectively, one of the metrics that I like to track in any MSP is called REM, R-H-E-M. And this stands for reactive hours per endpoint per month. It's simply dividing the time that your technicians are spending divided by the number of endpoints that you have as a loose indicator that maybe you're being really reactive with a lot of incidents, or maybe your alert fatigue is kind of getting out of control. But if we take a look at this axis point as far as the vendors that you're consuming, I would say it's pretty linear in the sense that the number of vendors that go up here in this category is almost a linear growth path with your REM metric. And that's really going to ultimately decrease, again, customer profitability here. And it's what none of us want, because we don't want to have not only a number of vendors that are eating into our margin, but also a lot of time spent. So the overall effective rate of those clients is actually going down. And so it's very important that we keep an eye on what our standards are and really focusing from the reactive approach that a lot of us take today. We're plugging a bunch of holes, we're responding to alerts and things of that nature, into more of the proactive in the sense of our policy management and what are our baselines that we're pushing out to our clients. And so I'm not saying that adopting vendors is the wrong path here, but when we talk about this, we're really talking about standardization in 2 ways here. First of which is under the product stack that you have. And by product stack, I'm meaning who do you use for AV? Who do you use for EDR? Who do you use for your security awareness training? And I think a lot of us are standardizing to that, where we have a primary vendor in those categories. But what we cannot answer really readily today is if they are all configured under what we would consider to be compliant. There's variations in settings, there's drift or deviations that occur within our environment. It's really hard to report on, but one of the things that you should be doing is standardizing your product stack across your customers and saying confidently that I have my preferred product stack there, because that ripples down not only from the security sense, but also from your operations as well too. The other standard that we talk about here, or standardization, is a compliance framework. And the takeaway here is not that you need to adopt a compliance framework, it's that you need to have a framework that you leverage that says, this is my MSP standard, this is XYZ standard that we use that is consistently applied across all of our customers. And at the top layer, that's kind of that risk assessment of to say, this is the security policies we push into place, but it could be everything across your operations to make that run really efficiently as well too. And so a lot of the standards that I always like to recommend here, or the 2 that I like to recommend, are the CIS controls and NIST CSF. And I like to do this mostly because these two offerings here are going to be pretty agnostic, right? You don't have to fall into regulatory compliance to really standardize here. They have some lexicon that's really easy to understand for most businesses, but it also gives us a North Star to work towards. That's not just us maintaining our own framework or our own standard. And a lot of us have a lack of confidence when we do that because we don't know if it's up to industry best practice or if it's helping and involving with the shifting landscape and security as well too. So when we talk about standardization, I'm always going to recommend one of these two frameworks, which is what I primarily built Cloud Capsule to go and help you perform in the sense of your North Star and your audit across Microsoft 365. So let's pivot into that tool so we can see more about what that's doing. So you can get to Cloud Capsule by going to cloudcapsule.io, and then here you can just simply type in a domain name that you're looking to run an assessment on. And this is what we're going to use to look at the framework that is mapped to CIS. When prompted, you'll sign in with the global admin credentials of the client. You have a bunch of read permissions here that you can consent to for the application. And then it's going to go ahead and start to perform an assessment for you. Once the assessment gets kicked off here, it'll run through a bunch of different data sets, actually mapping this to Microsoft standards. But effectively here, as these are going through, what we've done is we've mapped to the IG standards here, the implementation groups with the CIS controls. This is version 8.1, which does include the NIST CSF overlay of these. But within here, you can actually see the automated evidence collection that's taking place. But the main thing here is that the standards that we're taking is the CIS controls and the subsequent 18 controls that are within that makeup. And I love this just because it conforms nicely to the MSP. It's a lexicon that the customer can understand, and it's really hard to achieve in a lot of cases, even to just get the IG1 for all of our customers. But this is a great checklist that you can start to perform against your clients and measure up where they're at today and where they need to head. Okay, so if there's two takeaways here that I want you to go ahead and take home is that you should be standardizing your product stack and recognizing if you do have it in place across all of your customers. And then number two, if you have a compliance framework in mind as well too for your standard and what is your MSP standard that you're implementing in all of your customer environments. The byproducts of this is that not only are you becoming consistent, you're also creating a process that is reportable so that you can report as far as a gap analysis across your customers. And lastly, you're becoming proactive in your approach versus reactive, because you're getting ahead and you're being really strategic about what you go ahead and apply into your downstream customers. Okay, so the first step here in the framework is to audit. Another term you could use here is to assess. And really this is taking what we have as our standard that we set at the beginning here that we just talked about. And we're also understanding what our current state is for the client. And then we're simply performing a gap analysis across this void here. And that really is giving us a baseline here that we can use to say what maturity level are they at and what do I want to go ahead and start doing to help protect them within their environment. A lot of our time being spent is going to be performing this task upon onboarding, of course, with the client. But in a lot of cases, most cases, you're not going to be able to institute all of your security policies at once, mostly because that's too much change for the client to handle, and for you, probably a lack of resources, honestly, to perform all those time-intensive tasks. If you think about, they don't have 100% MFA adoption, they're using personal devices, they have a lack of EDR protection, their email is not being backed up. There's quite a lot of time that you could spend with that as well too. But really what we want to do here is perform this gap analysis within the audit so that we can begin to understand where they are in the sense of their journey compared to where our standards are being set. Let's take a look at the audit performed by Cloud Capsule. You can see this across a Microsoft 365 environment. After you run the assessment within Cloud Capsule, you not only get the mapping to the CIS controls, but you also get kind of a roll-up summary. The overview page is more of that executive summary that you could even share with the client to help them identify what exactly they're looking at today from a security perspective and what we would want to go do to implement within the account. But you have things like your secure score, but also just kind of a roll-up of anything that might be malicious or something that you would want to go pay attention to or remediate within their account, just to alleviate the risk that's going on. This is really like a penetration test against the tenant to identify, number one, do you have the policy configurations you should in place for proactive protections, but also any anomalies here that you would want to go take a look at, like non-compliant devices, users being excluded from MFA enforced policies. That seems like an excessive amount, more than just our break glass accounts. And these other tabs within Cloud Capsule also give you a lot more information about that individual domain in general as it relates to users, devices, email, etc. And within here, you can peel back a lot of different use cases that you'd want to go attend to, whether that's cleanup items like dormant users, licensed share mailboxes, things like that, versus also maybe having some global admins that don't have MFA enabled, or something like risky users identified within the accounts as well too. And this just keeps going across all the various facets like I mentioned. Too long to cover as part of this video, but definitely a great auditing tool that you can leverage to get a baseline of where this client matches up against your standards. Okay, so that's a great way to look at the Microsoft lens, and obviously you could augment that with some of the things that you're doing. One of the baselines that I would recommend in the sense of your overall audit is making sure you have some of these high-level buckets that come into play as far as your protections goes. And when we talk about that, you're really trying to look at a combination of your resources and time compared to impact. And I'm just going to combine those two into a metric here called level of effort. And then your other one here on the bottom axis, or the x-axis, is going to be impact. If we think about this, you really want, obviously the bottom right quadrant here in this example is where you'd want to be, where you have level of efforts low, the impact, security impact is going to be high. And in a lot of cases, that might be something like, turning on a policy that prevents users from registering third-party applications. Those applications can often be used as some persistence techniques. As an example of that, MFA, as a more direct example of rolling that out maybe through conditional access, might be a little bit higher because your level of effort is higher, given you might have to prep communications to the client to understand and help them from a help desk perspective for the users that have a little bit less tech savvy to get that up and running with Microsoft. We all know that story. When we think here though about kind of the broad surface area, I like to start bucketizing these in some various categories. So we talk about identity here. And really with identity, you can talk about MFA, I think is most important. And you could also talk about RBAC, or privileged roles is another way to term that as well too. When we talk about devices or security here, we're going to be talking about AV, EDR. We'll be talking about if they're managed or enrolled into our MDM solution. We're going to be talking about if they have a firewall in place. And we're going to be talking about if they are being patched and on an automated patch cycle. We talk about email protections. Number one, we can talk about generally security awareness training, if that's being pushed out to help out with end user training with phishing attacks, things like that. We can talk about email filtering capabilities or advanced email protections with filtering capabilities. And then we can also talk about domain authentication health as well too, things like SPF, DMARC, and DKIM that really go into overall email protections as well. We can talk about data and apps, which is definitely kind of a less mature area, I would say, in the MSP space. But we can talk here about your sharing policies for sensitive data, sensitive documents within the organization. We could talk about software vulnerabilities, and we could also talk about third-party backup as well, just to make sure those are protected in the case maybe that secondary layer of a ransomware incident versus preventing the ransomware incident. And this can go on and on. These are just some examples here of some of the protections you could put one in there for networking, port control, network access on a firewall that's at a deeper layer than just the device layer here as well. But effectively, this is also what you begin to create in a multi-tenant lens for the audit that you're doing across your customers, where maybe some of these, in these use cases, customer A has MFA checked off, they have RBAC where they don't have excessive global admins, things like that. They have their devices enrolled in MDM, But on the con side, they don't currently have any security awareness training. They don't have DMARC set up. They don't have any third-party backup. And you really begin to derive kind of just this general assessment as far as to say, what is that general gap that I have that covers the broad subset of some of these base level things that I should have instituted in every client, and to see that all in one report. You can track this also in a spreadsheet as well too without using any third-party tools, but you want to have this kind of match up to your standard as well, just so you can see that. And so we can move on to the next step, which is going to be around planning. Okay, so as you talk about the planning phase, obviously we want to prioritize our big ticket items in the sense of security, but we want to combine that with the resources and our capabilities as an MSP as well too. So with Cloud Capsule, really built that so that you could try to derive, certain high level projects. And in a lot of cases, the planning phase of implementation does really need to include kind of a project scope. So number one, you understand what time you're spending to it, but also in a lot of cases, there's going to be end user impact. So when we talk about projects here and just project examples in general, you could have things like, your MFA project. You could do a managed device project where you're saying we're going to eliminate all of the personal devices that are logging in and accessing resources on the network. We're going to roll them in MDM. You could have a project for security awareness training that would roll out to the organization. You could have another project here for instituting a data protection plan within the organization that looks at instituting DLP policies, sensitivity labels, things like that. And this kind of goes on and on for what you could do as well. But one of the biggest things that we can talk about here in the sense of the projects is what I really see from the MSP layer. The higher OML MSPs are really doing what I see here is uplift project work that they're actually charging for additionally on top of managed services here. So they're saying, hey, you want to do a security uplift because we saw these gaps within your environment. So you really take that assessment and reposition them back to say, this is why this matters. And these are the things that we need to do as part of a project for the time that's going to spend and the impact that it's going to create to your end users. In other cases, I just see MSPs bundling this in to their existing managed service offering and just doing it over time and not really charging the client for that, but saying this is part of the value add of what I'm delivering. I definitely think, if you can do this, this is definitely the route to go as far as the uplift, because you're spending a ton of time, actually implementing these things, and it's producing a high ROI for the client. And you're going to repeat that and really show them that when we get into the later phases with the monitoring section. So when we talk about the plan here and we talk about the execution of that plan, you really want to look at, number one, what uplift projects that you could have for what we see within the tenant that don't correspond to your environment or your standards that we talked about earlier. But those could also just be some things that you do behind the scenes, like instituting your third-party backup. And many of us should be charging for that, at the end of the day, for those additional services that we're offering. What this really evolves into, and many of us might be doing this today, but what this really evolves into for you as an MSP is more of a VCIO practice where you're going in and you're budging this out with the client and understanding that we have these projects. Obviously, we can't institute this much change to your environment right now, but also from a cost perspective, we really want to position these out and go ahead and maneuver into kind of a quarterly phased approach for instituting these security buckets. And we're going to say, these are the benefits that you get for each. This is going to be the cost for each. And this is going to be our continuous security and improvement plan. These might institute, some of these settings, but they might also just look at high level. If we go back to our frameworks component, might just say, we're going to go ahead and try to target IG1 with the CIS controls or implementation group 1 with the CIS controls. And that's all part of that audit or assessment that you did early on, right? We're doing either a self-assessment or more automated like we showed with Cloud Capsule, but that allows us to kind of scale up in the sense of setting goals and then instituting kind of a phased approach that is aligned to the budget of the client as well. Example of planning here within Cloud Capsule, you have all this information here. You could do a couple different projects as well too, like an MFA upgrade.
You could do a cleanup project for dormant users within the accounts. But one of the ones you could also do is seeing that there's 4 non-compliant devices within here. And we look at our Entra devices, we've got quite a many there in here without necessarily that same count within Intune. And all of those except for one are in a non-compliant. All those except for one are not encrypted. So you could just do a general managed device project just to make sure that you go through and you look at, who's personal owned that's enrolling into the solution, get these things cleaned up, but also elevate all their Entra devices into Intune as a clear example of something that you could resell as an upsell offering to the client. The benefits being that everything's managed. We can monitor device. We can monitor even access for only compliant devices within the account.
The third step here is implement or implementation. And I want to call out that I didn't actually use the word remediate. And I think there's a clear distinction here when we talk about remediation versus implementation as well too. And when we say that, I'm really talking about prevention. And ultimately, I don't consider remediation prevention in all use cases. Now, in some use cases it is, but a clear example of that is if within the Microsoft assessment, as an example, within your assessment, you find a bunch of dormant users within the Microsoft tenant, and effectively you're saying this is a security risk because a lot of attackers like to use these dormant accounts to maintain persistence, perform lateral movement, and things like that. So the remediation option in this particular use case would be saying that we're going to go ahead and we're going to just clean up all the dormant users. And that's really saying that we're going to either disable them that are active or we're going to delete them permanently from the account so they cannot be targeted in the future. Versus the prevention side of the house here that looks and says like what policies or processes can we put into place that will ultimately prevent this from happening altogether in the future. And that's a mental shift from saying that we're just going to plug this leaking pipe here with a patch or a piece of tape versus we're actually going to fix it from ever happening again. And that again, it gets into maturity levels where you're not spending more than the time it takes to push this into place to actually get this remediated versus saying that we're just going to constantly have to go ahead and attend to this over time when it happens. And that's how you kind of start to level up in security, become less reactive again, focus on the proactive and the strategic, where we want to be as MSPs if we can focus on growing our business as a whole versus spending all of our time cleaning up dormant users, right, as an example. And the really cool part about this is that if you really adopt this type of a mentality, when we zoom out, we take a look at this and we say, what's the culprit of dormant users? Where does this really occur from? Well, it's probably from breakdowns in your user offboarding SOP or process that you take today, whether that's because of human error or because something's being missed across the board or tickets aren't being submitted, whatever that might be. And what you say is here we have a better defined SOP to go ahead and institute for these users that maybe helps us, alleviate the dormant accounts that do end up showing up. But also through this, what you ultimately end up getting into is kind of the tertiary or fourth layer here, that you want to get into, which is looking at how can we automate these processes. There's one thing to put processes into place and there's one thing to have your standards in place, but the ultimate goal is to achieve automation not only through implementation, but also through monitoring and detection as well too. So really thinking about the holistic picture there. And in this case, you might be doing this as a RPA-driven flow, robotic process automation flow, with something like Power Automate, or if you use a company like Roost as an example, and this would automate deactivating these accounts or deleting them upon user offboard. So you get ahead and you can really just kind of eliminate the use case of this happening more frequently in the future again, and you're spending less time with it as well. And on that note of automation, the biggest thing that you want to do with your standards that you've set at the beginning is you really want to treat them like a stamp that you just take and you get from one tenant, your golden image tenant, if you will, and stamp them into the other, so that you're not only uploading and automating the policy creation, especially upon tenant onboarding, but that allows you to, again, monitor, which is the next section we'll get into here for Drift over time. So you really have all of your standards or policy configurations as part of this golden image, and then you're going ahead and pushing those out to all of your customers. And depending on what maturity state they're at or where they're at in general, you could be green lighting some of these policies and not others yet. They're more in a report only state, but eventually your goal is to green light all of them across all of your customers. And that's like a compliance score that they would have, compliance to your standard.
So within Cloud Capsule, you do have some implementation steps for remediation. And overall, again, that's not looking into, as in this example of how can I just clean up the devices that I haven't checked in, but more so, how can I put policies into place that would prevent this moving forward? So this, if you click on it, gives you some of the information as far as why it matters, the actual evidence behind this pass-fail value, but then also this is exactly telling you how to set up a policy in here within Intune to go ahead and clean up devices that have been basically not checking in for a certain time frame as well too. So that gets into a lot more than just, hey, go delete these devices out of the account. This is how we maintain this moving forward. And you'll see that span across all of these controls here that you have that relate to that certain evidence and remediation steps. And in some cases, you'll get into some policies here that get into even licensing considerations, the end user impact specifically, even with an end user notification template that you can use to deploy out to the end users as part of a proactive approach where it's directly going to impact them through these changes that you're looking to make. I also quickly wanted to point out that there are some third-party tools out there that get into full-on automated remediation that I'm not doing today in Cloud Capsule that are great. I've done a whole video on Lighthouse and CIPP, but these would be two tools that you can use to deploy baselines at scale across your tenants, where you can go ahead and create a baseline or look at your deployment insights to see how many of your policies are pushed out to your various individual customers. But when you go ahead and you had to create a baseline, you can create one off the cuff there as far as scratch, or you can create one based off of cloning another. But within these baselines, you have all these various policies which relate to what I would consider to be your standard for what you want to do. And one of the coolest things that you can do when you're going ahead and creating these, if I go back to the main page here, is that whenever you go to click into this, as far as the testing one goes here, you can add a task. You can actually clone in some conditional access policies or any of the device configuration from Intune as well to pull into here, where you're basically copying that from another tenant. And you can then deploy that out to multiple tenants, and it really speeds up your configuration. But again, starts to look at how can we look at making sure we have all of our baselines applied to our clients. SIP has the exact same functionality here. In some cases, a little bit better because you can even granularly control the users and groups that are applied. Too much to go through in one demo. Show that in a different video you can check out. But I wanted to showcase this to you because it's a good partnership in the sense of going from reporting to implementation and remediation.
So this leads us to the last step here, which is to monitor. And the great part about flowing down from our standards here is that we have a process that is not only reportable, but we could also monitor it for alerting capabilities as well too, as far as this becoming something that is what we call drift in the industry, or deviations. And these really mirror back up to the alerting concept here, so that if there's something that happens over time where your policies move outside of what you would consider to be your standard or compliant, then you can have alerts in place to go in and proactively push those back out to what should be a compliant state. A good example of this is if you have a conditional access policy, some users added to some group that's now excluded from an MFA enforced policy. That's something you really want to pay attention to, because that's where we start to get holes plugged into our policies over time. And when we talk about reportable, this is really important and is a concept that I like to use a lot, because this is the value that is often hidden from the customer that we need to do a better job about transcending down to them to show them, number one, what their investment has gotten them from a security sense, but also just to bring awareness that they're under attack all the time, and there's a lot of change in their tenant in a lot of cases, or their environment, that causes additional risk as well too. So when we talk about reportable, I want to talk about the changes that went on within that tenant over that time. Microsoft, as an example, they may have had new users join, they may have had new devices join to the network that maybe weren't in compliance, that maybe had active malware. You can show in the email flow kind of all the various types of attacks that were prevented based off of thousands of messages trying to come through that maybe are malicious in nature. And that awareness for them is a big reason why it makes you sticky as not only the provider, but it can also, in this particular case, when we talk about change, we're also talking about this concept of continuous improvement. And a lot of us today, I think, have leveraged SecureScore for trying to derive this and push this back down to the customer, not only because it's relatable to the customer, but it's just a metric that is easier to track in the sense of I can get point values that go up when I institute these security policies. But we want to think about a broader picture, I think, than that, in saying that you've actually gotten to IG1 compliance or IG2 compliance with CIS, or we've averaged up our NIST CSF score, cross-govern, identify, and so forth this past quarter as well too. And that helps them know that they're always on a continuous improvement path. And I don't think that ever stops, right? We always have new security controls that come into place or security protections we need to put in. So as much as you can, kind of showing this in, maybe it's on dedicated calls, maybe it's part of QBR events, things like that that you do with the customer, basically to show them that there's a lot going on in their tenant. We're keeping aware of it. Might be a monthly digest or PDF that you also send out to them as well too, to show them that, hey, there's a lot that's being protected here and you're still doing fine across the board as far as your protections. This is, again, our budgeting plan to help improve your security with these types of projects where you still have some gaps today as well.
So within Cloud Capsule, you can always come in and rerun an assessment here just to kind of see what's been updated since the last time you pushed out any policies. Recommendation would be to go ahead and use implementation either through the recommendations that we showed within here or one of those third-party tools, and rerun the assessment to see how you've leveled up since the last time, but also use it as a tool to monitor any anomalies within the tenant as well that maybe relate to any of these values that start to come back here on the assessment that relate to risk, particularly within the tenant. And this could span anywhere between the identity side all the way to your applications, and even things like your software inventory, which will come through here likely in a second, which relates to any of the CVE information right here for the applications installed on devices that's directly coming from Defender in this use case. And this is just, again, a great way to monitor this over time just to make sure that all of your tenants are in a healthy state.
And the final note here is just repeating these 4 steps over and over with your client for continuous improvement. When we take a look at this, what I love about this framework and this approach is that you really treat it from where you're at today, from what you can support as an MSP and your competencies across maybe some of these offerings, and then you allow yourself to step up over time. You have continuous improvement that ripples through your customers, but also you enact something like a change control board or a CAB for your standards here so that you can go ahead and add new standards, you can modify existing ones, or you could remove some of your standards that maybe are no longer applicable, or you've moved into a whole different type of process that eliminates that standard as a whole too, or maybe the landscapes just skip, right? We used to have a bunch of on-premise equipment that we no longer need anymore in a cloud-first approach. So I love this just because when you take a look at your standards, you can always begin to look at what additional standards can we put into place at a micro level. That could even be things like what conditional access policy standards do we have today within our ecosystem? What 5 policies do we try to push out in every tenant? And which one should we be looking at to institute to help against new attacks or just to cover broader surface area of that client that we involve as well too. So this is really important, that we have a constant process. Maybe it's biannually, maybe it's quarterly if you're a little bit bigger of a team or in charge of, somebody that has a little bit more of a micro focus on customers and you have that little bit more agile approach to this. But I love this because you can do this and you can swap also your product stack within there, so that way you're green lighting basically everybody and everything within your process here, so that number one, your team understands how to implement, how to support. Your customer recognizes the value of the offering and you can translate that down to them. But then additionally, when we take a look at this, you're additionally compounding the stickiness of your offering based off of including more and more, ideally, that you can report on as well too. So when we think about that, it's not only something that you can institute, you can think about reportability, value translation, as well as the automation behind that activity too. So that's everything I had for you guys today. Definitely check out Cloud Capsule to plug into this framework and get started with that tool kind of as your backbone or foundation for the things that you're doing. We're building a lot of cool features in there, so be sure to give us some feedback. If you have any questions about anything I went through, be sure to comment below. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, definitely subscribe to the channel if you're looking to learn more about the MSP space and Microsoft. I'll see you guys next week.